Welcome to Shadow Frames, where forgotten images reveal their darkest secrets. The photograph before us today appears innocent at first glance. A simple family portrait taken outside a weathered farmhouse in 1906. The image has that distinct sepia tone that speaks of another era, when photography was still something of an occasion, a moment preserved for posterity through careful preparation and solemn poses. The family stands arranged in a neat row before their modest homestead. Father, tall and stern in overalls, his weathered hands testifying to years of coaxing life from reluctant soil. Mother, her hair pulled tight beneath a simple bonnet, wearing her Sunday dress despite the visible dust that clings to its hem. 3 children, 2 boys and a girl, stand between them, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and the forced stillness required by the long exposure times of early 20th century photography. Behind them stretches their farm, a few acres carved from the wilderness through sweat and determination. A field of what appears to be corn extends toward the horizon, and at its edge, standing sentinel, is the Scarecrow that has drawn the attention of modern eyes. At first it seems unremarkable, just a cross-shaped frame draped with tattered clothing, topped with what appears to be an old hat stuffed with straw. A guardian against hungry birds, nothing more. But historians examining this image recently noticed something peculiar about this Scarecrow, something the family must have known as they posed proudly before their property. Look closely at the figure in the field. The proportions seem wrong. The arms too long. The posture somehow alert, despite its inanimate nature. The face, partially obscured by shadow, appears to have features more defined than simple bundles of straw should allow. And most disturbing of all is that a slight blur around its edges. In photography from this era, blur indicated movement during the exposure. The family's expressions take on new meaning upon closer inspection. The father's stern countenance might be read as warning. The mother's tight smile seems forced, her hand gripping her daughter's shoulder with white knuckles. The oldest boy's eyes appear fixed not on the camera but slightly to the side, as if keeping watch on something just out of frame. County records tell us this family, the Merricks, abandoned this promising homestead just 3 months after this photograph was taken, despite a bountiful harvest that year. They left most of their possessions behind, fled in the night according to neighbors' accounts. What did the historians see in that Scarecrow that has them now poring through local records and consulting with experts in early 20th century rural folklore? Why would a family leave behind the fruits of years of labor? And most chilling of all, what kind of Scarecrow needs to be watched so carefully by those it supposedly protects? The photograph sits in a university archive now, the Merrick family long gone. But something about their expressions, and that figure standing in their field, continues to unsettle all who study it closely. Local historian Abigail Foster first noticed the anomaly while digitizing the county's photographic archive. For 30 years, she'd examined period photographs, but something about the Merrick family portrait caused her to wake in the night, troubled by half-remembered dreams of cornfields and watching eyes. I dismissed it initially, she confides, her fingers tracing the edge of the now preserved image. Rural families often created elaborate scarecrows, not just as bird deterrents but as folk art. But then I began researching the property's history. What Foster uncovered in the dusty ledgers of county records painted a disturbing pattern. The Merrick land had changed hands with unusual frequency in the decades before they acquired it in 1902. 5 previous families had attempted to establish farms there, none remaining longer than 4 years. The land records contained curious notations: property abandoned, owners relocated under unusual circumstances, and most tellingly, field guardian remains. Foster's research led her to discover personal journals from Martha Simmons, whose family neighboring the Merricks. The faded pages contained entries from summer 1906. Mrs. Merrick came calling today, seemed troubled, asked about the old stories of the place. I told her what my grandmother said, that the land belonged to something else before any white settlers came, that it allows farming but demands tribute. She went pale and would not stay for tea. 2 weeks later, saw the Merrick children playing at the field's edge. They have a game they play. None will turn their back to the Scarecrow. Even in play, they keep it in sight. Young Henry Merrick told my boy they must always watch it, that father says it moves when no one looks. The final entry dated 3 days before the Merrick's disappearance. Thomas Merrick appeared at our door past midnight, wild-eyed, asking for blessed salt. His Scarecrow, he said, was no longer in the field, but at the edge of their garden when they woke this morning. No wind could have moved it so. He is taken to sleeping in shifts with his shotgun. Agricultural records from 1906 note the Merrick farm produced a harvest 30% larger than any neighboring property, despite identical soil conditions. The local paper praised Thomas Merrick's farming prowess in September, just weeks before the family's unexplained departure. Most unsettling were the parish records Foster discovered last month. The local minister had been called to the Merrick farm twice that summer to bless the fields. His personal diary, recently donated to the Historical Society, mentioned, "An unwholesome arrangement I fear they entered, knowingly or not. The abundance of their crops speaks of unnatural fertility. The thing they call a scarecrow watches with hungry eyes. God help them if they fail to satisfy its appetite." Contemporary accounts from the next family to purchase the property reported finding the scarecrow standing inside the abandoned Merrick home, positioned before the family dining table where 5 place settings lay undisturbed, as if waiting for dinner guests who never arrived. The archives yielded their secrets slowly, but Foster was not alone in her obsession with the Merrick photograph. Dr. Elliot Chambers, an anthropologist specializing in rural American folk practices, arrived in the small county museum on a rainy Tuesday morning, his reputation preceding him. "What we're seeing isn't unique to this region," Chambers explained, spreading out comparative photographs from across the Midwest and Appalachians. Agricultural guardian figures appear throughout human history, from the Roman Priapus to corn mothers of indigenous traditions. But something changed in the late 19th century in certain American farming communities. Chambers pointed to similar cases. Farms with inexplicable prosperity followed by sudden abandonment. Each photograph showed a similar figure watching from field edges, each family displaying that same wary awareness in their posed portraits. They called it different names depending on the region: the yield keeper, the harvest man, Old Scarecrow. But the practice was consistent, a bargain struck for abundance. Foster introduced Chambers to Elijah Merrick, 93 years old and living in a nursing home 2 counties over, the last surviving child from the photograph, though he had been only 5 when it was taken. Age had bent his frame and clouded his eyes, but his mind remained razor sharp, especially when asked about the family farm. "We don't speak of it," he said initially, his gnarled hands trembling on the blanket covering his lap. "Mother made us promise, said talking about it might make it remember us." After gentle coaxing and the promise that the information might help others, Elijah finally relented. "Father found it already standing in the field when we bought the place. Previous owner said never to remove it, just maintain it. Each season we had to replace the clothes with new ones. Feed it first portions of any meal. The crops grew like nothing you've ever seen." Elijah's eyes darted to the window before continuing. "It would change positions overnight, just small movements at first. Father said it was watching over the crops. But that summer, the photograph summer, its movements grew bolder. Mother found it on the porch one morning, said its head had turned to watch her through the window." The old man's voice dropped to a whisper. The bargain was simple: abundance for acknowledgement, prosperity for priority. But Father made a mistake after that big harvest. He sold everything, planning to pay off the farm. Didn't set aside the first portion. Tears welled in the old man's eyes. That night we heard it on the roof, scratching. Father took us through the storm cellar tunnel that led to the woods. We ran with nothing but the clothes on our backs, Mother screaming at us never to look behind. Foster and Chambers exchanged glances as Elijah composed himself. The worst part wasn't fleeing. It was knowing someone else would buy the farm, find it waiting, standing guard over all that fertile soil, the cycle beginning again. Recent satellite imagery of the old Merrick property, now abandoned for decades, shows an anomaly that modern analysts cannot explain. A perfectly circular area of vegetation in the middle of the overgrown fields, with what appears to be a single upright figure at its center. The county has since placed the land off limits, citing unstable structures, but local teenagers who occasionally venture there on dares report the same thing: a scarecrow that seems to face you, no matter which direction you approach from. The Merrick photograph found its way to Dr. Vanessa Liu, a forensic image analyst who normally worked with law enforcement. Her specialty, detecting manipulated images, seemed an odd fit for historical research, but Foster had become convinced something beyond the usual photographic anomalies was present. Early photography had its share of artifacts and peculiarities, Dr. Liu explained, adjusting the specialized lighting over the original print. Long exposures, chemical imperfections, plate scratches, all can create illusions. Yet what she discovered defied conventional explanation. Using spectral analysis to examine different light frequencies within the image, Liu revealed something the naked eye couldn't perceive. The density pattern around the scarecrow differs from the rest of the photograph, she demonstrated, pointing to a computer-enhanced rendering. This suggests the figure was moving significantly faster than environmental factors like wind would explain. And here, she indicated barely perceptible lines extending from the scarecrow's form. These appear to be additional limbs captured at different moments during exposure. Most disturbing was the face. Enhanced and magnified, what had appeared to be a crude burlap sack showed distinct features. Deep-set eyes with pinpoint pupils, a wide slash of a mouth. This isn't pareidolia, our tendency to see faces in random patterns, Liu insisted. There's deliberate structure here. The photograph's provenance led Foster to Emmett Dawson, great-grandson of the photographer who captured the Merrick family portrait. In his attic sat the original camera, a mahogany box with brass fittings, remarkably preserved. Great-grandfather never used this camera after that day, Dawson explained, reluctance evident as he handled the antique. Said it was tainted. Family story says he looked through the viewfinder and saw the scarecrow wave at him, though it appeared stationary to everyone else. Inside the camera's case, Foster discovered a yellowed envelope containing undeveloped plates. With specialized techniques to process the century-old exposures, 3 additional photographs emerged, taken immediately after the known portrait. The sequence was unmistakable. In each successive image, the scarecrow had moved closer to the family. In the final photograph, only the children remained in the frame, their expressions frozen in terror, while a blurred shape loomed at the edge of the image. No longer a scarecrow, but something tall and spindly, its proportions inhuman. Armed with this evidence, Foster revisited county agricultural records. Every farm that had occupied that plot showed the same pattern: unprecedented yields followed by abandonment. Modern soil samples from surrounding areas showed normal fertility, yet core samples from the Merrick land revealed inexplicable organic compounds that soil scientists couldn't identify. Whatever arrangement these families entered into wasn't metaphorical, Chambers concluded. The land itself seems to have agency, or hosts something that does. Most revealing was the discovery of Thomas Merrick's last will and testament, filed hastily the day before the family's disappearance. It contained a single cryptic warning: to any who would work this land, know that its bounty comes at price. What stands in the field is not a thing of human making. It was here before us, will remain after us. It guards not the crops from birds, but the ancient pact from violation. Feed it first. Never forget who truly owns the harvest. And never, under pain of soul, allow it inside your home. The small county museum's interest in the Merrick photograph unexpectedly catapulted it into national attention. After a segment on an obscure paranormal podcast went viral, Foster found herself fielding calls from television producers and self-proclaimed paranormal investigators, much to her dismay. This isn't entertainment, she insisted during an emergency meeting of the Historical Society. Whatever happened to the Merricks, and other families on that land, was tragic. We need to approach this with scholarly rigor, not sensationalism. But amid the unwanted publicity came an unexpected lead. A woman named Clara Whitfield contacted the museum from Nebraska, claiming her grandmother had been a childhood friend of Mary Merrick, the mother in the photograph. She kept a box of letters, Clara explained when Foster arranged a video call. My grandmother and Mary corresponded for years before the Merricks moved to that farm, and for the months they lived there. I found them after my grandmother passed last year. The letters, which Clara agreed to loan to the museum, painted a disturbing progression. Early correspondence showed Mary's excitement about their new beginning, how the previous owner had practically given the farm away, insisting only on one peculiar condition. Thomas thinks the old man's demands about the scarecrow are mere superstition, Mary wrote in April 1906. But he humors him. We make offerings of the first fruits as instructed. The children have made a game of it, leaving little gifts. The harvests are better than we dreamed possible. By June, the tone had shifted. Something is wrong with the guardian, as the old man called it. It no longer stays where Thomas places it. The children say it whispers when they're alone in the fields. Thomas says I'm being fanciful, but I've seen him watching it too. The final letter, dated 3 days before their disappearance, was never sent. Clara's grandmother had found it years later, tucked inside a family Bible that Mary had apparently given her during a visit weeks earlier. "It knows we plan to leave," the shaky handwriting read. "Harvest is in, but we held nothing back for it this year. Thomas says we can break free of this place with enough money to start fresh elsewhere. But it knows. Last night I woke to find soil on our bedroom floor, not tracked in, but a perfect circle, as if planted. This morning, all our seedlings were dead. The Scarecrow stood in the kitchen when I came down before dawn. I'm sending the children to stay with my sister tomorrow. Thomas refuses to leave until he sells the farm. God forgive us for what we've done, for the bargain we've kept, and now broken." Professor Chambers returned from consulting with ethnobotanists who'd analyzed soil samples from the property. His expression was grave as he spread their findings across Foster's desk. The organic compounds in the soil aren't just unusual, they're impossible. Plants grown in this medium develop cellular structures that essentially make them partly animal in nature. They're hybrids, drawing nutrients like parasites while photosynthesizing. Foster looked up from the report, connecting threads. "So the bargain was feeding it through the crops," Chambers finished. "Families who worked that land weren't just feeding the Scarecrow ritual offerings. They were feeding it through every bite they consumed. The crops themselves were extensions of whatever it is." Foster recalled the parish minister's diary entry about unnatural fertility and the unwholesome arrangement. And when Thomas Merrick sold all their harvest instead of keeping some for the entity, they broke the cycle of consumption. Chambers nodded grimly. The thing in the field needed to be fed not just symbolically but literally, through them. The museum's phone rang, interrupting them. It was Dr. Liu, her voice tense with urgency. "I've been analyzing the spectral data from the photograph against weather records from that day," she said without preamble. "The shadows are wrong. The family's shadows fall exactly where they should based on the sun's position that afternoon. But the Scarecrow's shadow, it points in the opposite direction, as if its light source came from below, not above." The Merrick photograph had become the center of a quiet storm. Foster stared at the light table where the original print lay beside Liu's enhanced digital versions, trying to reconcile impossible conclusions. She had entered this investigation expecting to document local history, not uncover something that challenged her understanding of reality. "We need to see it," she said finally to Chambers. The actual location. Despite county restrictions, Foster arranged access through official channels, citing historical preservation concerns. On a crisp autumn morning, a small team assembled at the overgrown entrance to the former Merrick property. Foster, Chambers, Liu, and reluctantly, a county sheriff's deputy named Ramirez. The farmhouse had collapsed decades ago, leaving only a stone foundation surrounded by nature's reclamation. Yet as they approached the perimeter of the fields, everyone noticed the unnatural circle of vegetation visible from satellite imagery was even more pronounced up close. A perfect disk of vibrant growth amid otherwise normal wilderness. "Temperature's dropping," Liu noted, checking her equipment. "It's nearly 10 degrees cooler inside the circle boundary." Chambers knelt at the edge, careful not to cross into the verdant area. "The vegetation here isn't just thriving, it's wrong. These plants shouldn't coexist in these arrangements. Different growing seasons, incompatible soil requirements." Deputy Ramirez, initially skeptical, now maintained a respectful distance. "My grandfather used to tell stories about this place, called it the Hungry Field. Said it was best left to its own appetites." At the circle's center stood not the Scarecrow they expected, but a weathered wooden post, a simple upright timber around which vegetation grew most densely. Foster approached it cautiously, camera in hand. "I wouldn't touch that," Ramirez warned. But Foster had already noticed something carved into the aged wood. Dates, dozens of them, spiraling down the post, each corresponding to a family's tenure on the property, ending with the Merricks in 1906. But below these was a much older set of markings, symbols rather than numbers, etched deeply into the wood. "Pre-colonial," Chambers whispered, examining them without touching. "Similar to protective wards found in certain indigenous practices, but inverted. Not to keep something out, but to keep something in," Foster finished. The wind shifted, bringing an earthy, sweet smell reminiscent of freshly turned soil and overripe fruit. Liu's recording equipment suddenly failed with a burst of static. "We should go," Ramirez insisted, his hand resting on his holster. "Something's not right." As they retreated toward their vehicles, Foster noticed movement in her peripheral vision, a tall, thin shadow passing between trees at the field's edge. Turning quickly, She saw nothing but swaying branches. That evening, reviewing photographs from their visit, Foster noticed something they'd missed on site. Each team member's shadow stretched normally across the ground in every image, except in the shots nearest the wooden post. There, their shadows bent slightly, curving toward the center of the circle, as if pulled by gentle gravity. Most disturbing was the final photograph, taken hastily as they departed. Behind them, barely visible among the trees at the field's edge, stood a figure, not quite human in proportion, its limbs too long, its posture too alert. And though the distance made details impossible to discern, it appeared to be wearing what looked remarkably like Deputy Ramirez's jacket, which he'd removed and draped over a fence post during their investigation. The jacket he'd forgotten to retrieve when they left. The following morning, Foster's landline rang before dawn. Deputy Ramirez's voice came through, strained and hoarse. "I went back for my jacket," he said without preamble. "Yesterday evening after our visit. I thought it would be simple. Just hop the fence, grab it, and go." Foster sat upright, sleep evaporating instantly. "What happened?" "It wasn't on the fence post. I found it in the middle of that circle, hanging on the wooden marker like someone had placed it there deliberately." His voice dropped lower. "I shouldn't have gone after dark. Shouldn't have gone alone." "Are you all right?" Foster asked, already reaching for her clothes. A long pause followed. "I'm not injured, but I'm not sure I came back alone." Foster arranged an immediate meeting at the county museum's back office, away from curious eyes. Ramirez arrived looking haggard, dark circles under bloodshot eyes. He placed a soil sample container on the table with trembling hands. "I took this from inside that circle. Thought it might help your research." The deputy wouldn't meet her gaze. "Since last night I've been hungry. Not normal hunger. I ate everything in my refrigerator when I got home. Stopped at an all-night diner on the way here. Nothing satisfies it." Chambers arrived shortly after, examining the soil sample with evident concern. "This isn't just soil. There are filaments running through it. Organic structures unlike anything I've seen before." Lou joined them via video call, her face grave as she shared her screen. "I've completed acoustic analysis of our recording equipment malfunction. When cleaned up and adjusted, there's a pattern in the static." She played the enhanced audio. The sound that emanated from the speakers was rhythmic, almost like breathing, but underneath ran a whispered phrase repeating, "First portion, first portion, first portion." "The bargain," Foster whispered. "It's still active." Ramirez pushed up his sleeve, revealing an alarming sight. Thin, green-black lines tracing up from his wrist along his veins. "Started this morning, spreading slowly. I feel it, moving inside me." Chambers examined the markings without touching them. "You brought something back with you. The entity may be bound to that circle, but it can extend its influence through carriers. We need to get you to a hospital," Foster insisted, but Ramirez shook his head violently. "No doctors. My grandfather told me what happens if this thing marks you. Said his uncle encountered it back in 1930. Medical intervention only speeds the process." Lou interrupted, her voice urgent. "I found something in the Merrick correspondence. A letter Mary wrote but apparently never sent to her sister. It mentions a ritual the previous owner performed each harvest. Something about feeding back to maintain balance." "The first portion," Chambers murmured. "Not just taking from the land but returning something to it." Ramirez's eyes suddenly widened, his pupils contracting to pinpoints. When he spoke again, his voice carried an unfamiliar cadence, almost musical, but deeply wrong. "The land remembers older bargains than yours," he said, though not entirely with his own voice. "Before your people came with plows and boundaries, the old ones knew. To take, one must give. Balance maintained through consumption and offering." Foster instinctively backed away as Ramirez's head tilted at an unnatural angle, a smile too wide stretching across his face. "I hunger," he said simply. "And now, through him, I can seek what I'm owed beyond my borders." A hastily assembled ritual fence now encircled Deputy Ramirez in the museum's storage room. Salt lines, blessed water, and hastily photocopied protective symbols from Chambers' reference books created a makeshift boundary. The entity speaking through Ramirez tested its edges occasionally, reaching out only to withdraw with a hiss when encountering the barriers. "We need to understand what we're dealing with," Foster whispered to Chambers as they consulted outside the circle. "Not just contain it. The museum archives might hold something," Chambers replied. "This entity predates European settlement. There must be indigenous accounts." Foster made a call to Eleanor Whitehawk. cultural historian for the regional tribal council. Within an hour, the elder woman arrived, her face grave as she observed Ramirez through the storage room window. "My grandmother spoke of this," Eleanor said quietly. "The hunger that walks. Before your people's farms, our people knew certain lands were different, places where the boundary between worlds thinned. The hunger from the other side could cross over, but only if invited." "The Scarecrow," Foster began. "A vessel," Eleanor nodded. "Many tribes left offerings at the boundaries of such places, respectful exchanges, but never invitations to cross over. Your ancestors misunderstood. Instead of honoring the boundary, they created doorways." Inside the storage room, Ramirez convulsed suddenly, the green-black lines now reaching his neck. "Feed me," he growled, but the voice was becoming less human with each passing hour. Eleanor opened an ancient leather pouch, removing what appeared to be dried herbs and roots. "This won't destroy it. Nothing can. But it might force it to release its hold on this man." "And return to its boundary?" Chambers asked hopefully. Eleanor's expression remained solemn. "That depends on how much of itself has transferred already. The hunger is patient. It may have been gradually crossing over through families for generations, gaining strength through each broken bargain." As they worked to prepare Eleanor's ritual materials, Foster received an urgent call from Liu. "I've been analyzing soil samples from surrounding properties," Liu explained, her voice tense. "The museum's digital historical maps showed me something alarming. That circular growth pattern, it's expanded by 17 feet in diameter since the 1960s aerial surveys. The boundary is growing, Foster." Foster felt cold dread settle in her stomach. "How quickly?" "Accelerating. Almost imperceptible for decades, then faster in recent years. If my calculations are correct, it's grown 3 inches just since our visit yesterday." The implications were staggering. Whatever anchored the entity to that land was weakening. The broken bargains, the abandoned farms, each failure might have eroded the boundaries containing it. Through the window, Foster watched Ramirez wrestling with the thing inside him, his body contorting into impossible angles before collapsing into stillness. The green-black lines now formed intricate patterns across his visible skin, pulsing with an internal rhythm. "We have to return it," Eleanor said firmly, mixing her preparations. "Not just contain it. The deputy is not the problem. He's merely the symptom. Something has disturbed a balance maintained for countless generations." Foster thought of the wooden post with its carved dates and ancient symbols, the marker in the field. "It's not just recording occupants. It's a binding post," Eleanor confirmed, "and something is causing it to fail." The circle of salt around Ramirez cracked and shifted as the floorboards beneath him began to warp and splinter. Tiny green shoots emerged from the fractures, growing visibly as they stretched toward him. Eleanor's eyes widened as she hurriedly completed her mixture. "Something's accelerating the process," she warned, grinding dried leaves between weathered palms. "The hunger has found fertile ground in him." Foster thought of the undeveloped photographic plates, the progression of the Scarecrow moving closer to the Merrick family with each exposure. It's not just feeding, it's replacing. Taking over bit by bit, Chambers returned from his car with additional reference materials, stopping short at the doorway. "The temperature in here has dropped 15 degrees since I left." The walls of the storage room had begun to develop a sheen of moisture, droplets forming and running downward in unnatural patterns, not straight down with gravity, but in spiral formations that seemed to echo the carvings on the wooden post in the field. "We need to act now," Eleanor insisted, lighting a small bundle of herbs. The smoke curled upward, unusually dense and white. "The deputy is merely a conduit. We must close the pathway." As the aromatic smoke filled the room, Ramirez's body went rigid, his back arching at an impossible angle. His mouth opened in a silent scream, revealing teeth that seemed somehow too numerous, too sharp. The green-black lines across his skin began to pulse with increasing intensity. "It's fighting the separation," Eleanor explained, her voice steady despite the horrific scene before them. In its original form, the hunger could only influence through consumption, through what was grown in its soil and eaten by its caretakers. But through the deputy, it's found a way to move freely. The smoke thickened around Ramirez, appearing to coalesce into tendrils that wrapped around his convulsing form. Where the smoke touched the green-black markings, they seemed to recede slightly, retreating beneath his skin. The binding post, Foster realized suddenly. The Merrick photograph shows it clearly, not as a simple wooden stake, but as a full figure. The Scarecrow itself. Chambers nodded grimly. The post we saw yesterday is just what remains. The rest has degraded, or been consumed by the entity itself, gradually freeing it. Eleanor's chanting grew louder as Ramirez's convulsions intensified. Suddenly, his body went completely still. The smoke surrounding him began to darken, changing from white to gray to an oily black that seemed to absorb light rather than emit it. "Something's wrong," Eleanor whispered, backing away. "It's using my ritual to pull more of itself through." The black smoke swirled violently, forming a vaguely humanoid shape above Ramirez's prone form. Tall, thin, with limbs too long and joints that bent in impossible ways. For a moment, it hovered there, seeming to gather itself. Then it spoke, not with Ramirez's voice or even the hybrid voice from before, but in a sound like rustling corn stalks and crumbling soil. "You broke the bargain," it whispered, the words somehow perfectly audible despite their softness. "You took without giving. You harvested without planting. You consumed without being consumed." Its formless head turned toward Foster, and though it had no visible eyes, she felt its attention like a physical weight. "And now I remember you, historian. You who disturbed my slumber with your questions. You who called attention to what was forgotten." The smoky figure extended one impossibly elongated arm toward her. "You owe me a portion, the first portion, as it has always been." The temperature in the storage room plummeted further as the entity's smoke form solidified, gaining definition with each passing second. Foster found herself unable to move as it reached for her, the chill in her bones not entirely from the supernatural cold. Eleanor moved with surprising speed, casting the remainder of her herbal mixture in a wide arc that temporarily disrupted the entity's form. "Run!" she commanded, her voice carrying authority that broke Foster's paralysis. They retreated to the museum's main gallery, dragging Ramirez's unconscious body with them. The deputy's skin still bore faint traces of the greenish-black markings, but they had faded significantly. "It's following," Chambers warned, glancing back at the tendrils of dark smoke seeping under the doorway. "We need to understand what truly binds it," Eleanor said, her breathing labored from the exertion. "Not just where, but how. The boundary post is weakening because something about the original arrangement has been forgotten." Foster's mind raced through the fragments of information they'd gathered. The Merricks broke their bargain by selling their entire harvest. But that can't be the whole story. The entity's confinement predates their arrival by centuries. Ramirez stirred, his eyes fluttering open. Though still weak, his voice was his own again. "I saw, while it was inside me. Not just memories, knowledge." He struggled to sit up against a display case. The post wasn't placed there to contain it. The entity itself created the boundary. "That makes no sense," Chambers objected. "Why would it limit itself?" "Balance," Eleanor whispered, understanding dawning. "The old stories speak of entities that required balance above all. Not good or evil as European traditions understand them, but equilibrium between taking and giving." Ramirez nodded weakly. "It bound itself willingly as part of an ancient pact with the original inhabitants. They would provide regular offerings, and it would constrain its hunger to that circle of land, making it fertile beyond imagining. But something changed," Foster said, watching the smoke continue to pour into the room, gathering like a storm cloud near the ceiling. "The offerings stopped," Eleanor confirmed. "When my people were displaced, the rituals maintaining the boundary were disrupted. The European settlers who followed didn't understand the true nature of the arrangement. The smoke above them began spinning faster, forming a vortex that extended downward like a tornado in miniature. The Scarecrow was its permitted form within the circle," Ramirez continued urgently. "A physical manifestation it could use to tend the land and receive offerings. But each failed bargain with new families weakened the boundary it had set for itself." Foster suddenly understood with perfect clarity. It's not just hunger driving it now, it's rage. Centuries of broken promises, the families who fled, the offerings that stopped. It believes it's owed a debt. The vortex of smoke descended toward them, resolving again into that impossibly tall, thin figure. Its voice resonated through the museum's open space, rattling display cases and picture frames. "The first portion is mine by right. The boundary falls. The hunger walks." Eleanor stepped forward, her small frame somehow imposing as she faced the entity. "You forgot your purpose, hunger that walks. You existed in balance once. The boundary was your creation, your promise." The entity paused, smoke swirling in apparent confusion. Foster saw their opportunity and took it. The ancient photographs from the county archives had rendered their troubling secrets, but one question haunted Foster as she faced the spectral entity: how to restore a boundary that had existed in balance for centuries before being corrupted by misunderstanding and broken promises. "The first portion must be given freely," Eleanor called out, her voice somehow cutting through the howling wind that now circulated through the museum. "Not taken by force." That was the original covenant. Foster's mind raced to the agricultural records they'd examined, the pattern of abundance followed by abandonment. Each family had inadvertently fed the entity through crops grown in its soil, but none had understood the true exchange required. "The binding post contains your history," Foster said, addressing the swirling darkness directly. "Every family that failed you, every broken promise carved into its surface. But the original symbols, the ones predating European settlement, those weren't records of failure. They were the terms of your agreement." The smoky form hesitated, its elongated limbs momentarily still. "We need to make a new offering," Chambers realized, his voice hushed with revelation. Not out of fear, but with understanding. From his pocket, Ramirez withdrew something, a handful of soil he'd instinctively collected from the museum floor where the entity had temporarily possessed him. Mixed within it were tiny seeds, sprouting impossibly fast in his palm. "A giving and a taking," Eleanor nodded approvingly. As it was meant to be, Foster stepped forward, removing an heirloom locket from around her neck, a family treasure containing a tiny photograph of her grandmother. "My first portion," she said, extending it toward the entity. "Freely given, knowledge for knowledge, memory for memory." The swirling darkness contracted, seeming to study her offering with unseen eyes. Then, with unexpected gentleness, tendrils of smoke wrapped around the locket, absorbing it. Throughout the museum, display cases containing artifacts from the region's agricultural history began to vibrate softly. Inside them, preserved crop specimens, corn husks, wheat sheaves, dried apples from centuries past, stirred as if in a gentle breeze. "It's calling to what was grown in its soil through the generations," Eleanor whispered. "Everything connected to it." The entity's form began to change, smoke reconfiguring into something less threatening, still tall and otherworldly, but now resembling the Scarecrow from the Merrick photograph, its proportions settling into a more recognizable silhouette. "We must complete the circle," Ramirez said weakly, struggling to his feet. "The boundary requires renewal through ritual, not containment, but cooperation." Through the museum windows, Foster noticed something alarming. Plants throughout the town were bending, all facing toward the museum as if drawn by some invisible force. Tree branches stretched unnaturally, flowers turned on impossible angles. "It's reaching beyond its traditional boundaries," Chambers observed with quiet horror, "trying to reclaim everything grown from its influence over generations." Eleanor closed her eyes, reaching into cultural memory. "There was a song, a planting song my grandmother taught me. Part of the original bargain included music to remind the hunger of its proper place." As she began to sing in her native tongue, the entity grew still, listening. The smoky figure inclined its head as if recognizing something long forgotten. Her voice quavered at first, then strengthened as ancient syllables echoed through the museum halls. The entity's smoky form rippled in response, its movements becoming more fluid, less threatening. Foster felt a strange resonance building within the chamber, as if the air itself vibrated with recognition. "The song marks boundaries," Eleanor explained between verses, never breaking rhythm. "It reminds both parties of their proper domains and responsibilities." As Eleanor continued singing, Chambers carefully arranged Ramirez's handful of sprouting soil in a perfect circle on the floor. The tiny green shoots were growing visibly, minute by minute, reaching upward with unnatural speed. The original bargain wasn't just about offerings, Foster realized, watching the entity's reaction. It was about limitation through mutual agreement. The hunger confined itself willingly as part of a reciprocal relationship. The entity's form solidified further, no longer amorphous smoke, but something with definite edges, a figure of twisted roots and woven grasses, crowned with a head that resembled both human and plant in unsettling combination. When it spoke again, its voice carried echoes of rustling fields and distant thunder. "The song remembers," it acknowledged, "but the circle is broken. The post weakens. I hunger beyond my bounds now." Foster looked to Eleanor, who nodded without interrupting her song. Understanding passed between them. The ritual needed completion, needed closing. From the soil circle on the floor, The sprouting plants had grown almost 6 inches tall, forming a miniature forest. Within this growth, something glinted. Foster knelt cautiously. Finding her locket had reappeared, transformed. The metal had developed intricate patterns resembling the carvings on the boundary post, and inside her grandmother's photograph remained but was now bordered by tiny perfect renderings of ancient symbols. "A contract," Chambers whispered, understanding. "It's creating a new physical manifestation of the agreement." Foster carefully lifted the locket, feeling an unusual warmth radiating from it. "This needs to return to the boundary post," she said with certainty, "to renew what was forgotten." The entity inclined its woven head. "The bearer brings the boundary. The circle closes again, but the debt remains for generations of taking without giving." Eleanor's song reached a crescendo, then softened to a gentle, repeating melody. "The original agreement included periodic renewal," she explained, "seasonal offerings, recognition of mutual existence. Your people abandoned this understanding when mine were forced away. Then we establish it anew," Foster declared, closing her hand around the transformed locket. "Regular acknowledgement, proper offerings, museum exhibits that tell the true history of this land and its guardian." The entity seemed to consider this, its form swaying like wheat in a gentle breeze. Finally, it extended one long, branch-like arm toward Foster. "The bearer becomes the keeper," it pronounced. "The boundary restored through your bloodline, as it once was through others. When you return the marker, the hunger returns to its proper domain. But it remembers those who broke faith before. It will watch always for betrayal." Outside the museum windows, the unnaturally bent plants gradually returned to their normal positions. The unnatural cold receded from the room. But Foster understood with perfect clarity that she had entered into a covenant that would follow her family for generations to come. The weight of the transformed locket hung heavy against Foster's chest as she drove toward the Merrick property at dawn, Eleanor's song still echoing in her mind. The county sheriff had reluctantly provided access again, skeptical but shaken by Deputy Ramirez's condition. The man remained under observation at the hospital, the doctors baffled by the residual green-black markings that appeared and disappeared beneath his skin like tidal patterns. "The bargain is incomplete until the marker is restored," Chambers had explained before Foster insisted on making the journey alone. "The entity has chosen you as its new keeper." Now, as morning mist clung to the overgrown fields, Foster understood the responsibilities she had inherited. Each step toward the perfect circle of unnatural vegetation felt like walking into another world, the air growing thicker, sounds dampening except for the whisper of plants bending subtly toward her passage. The wooden post stood as before, weathered and ancient at the circle's center. But approaching it now, Foster perceived details previously invisible, intricate patterns flowing through the grain of the wood itself, alive with meaning. The carved dates and symbols pulsed faintly in the early light, as if acknowledging her presence. "I understand now," Foster whispered, removing the locket from around her neck. The metal had grown warmer against her skin during the drive, and now it practically hummed with energy. As she held it toward the post, thin tendrils of green extended from the surrounding vegetation, reaching toward the locket with deliberate purpose. Foster fought her instinct to recoil, forcing herself to remain still as the tendrils delicately wrapped around the locket, drawing it from her palm. "The first portion, freely given," she recited, remembering Eleanor's instructions. The boundary maintained, the balance restored. The tendrils pulled the locket toward the post, where a previously unnoticed hollow had formed. As the locket settled inside, the wood seemed to flow around it, accepting and absorbing the offering until no trace remained visible. A profound stillness fell over the circle. The constant background whisper of vegetation ceased entirely for several heartbeats. Then, rising from beneath Foster's feet, came a sensation of movement, not an earthquake, but something more intentional. The soil shifted minutely as an intricate network of roots spread outward from the post, forming a perfect circular pattern that glowed faintly green before fading from sight. The boundary was restored, but Foster understood with sudden clarity that her connection to this place, to the entity, would never be severed. She felt it in her blood now, the awareness of the hunger contained within this circle, and her hereditary obligation to maintain that containment. In her mind, words formed that were not her own. The keeper remembers. The keeper returns. Each season, each generation. Foster nodded, accepting the terms with full understanding. I will remember. I will return. As she turned to leave, a single cornstalk sprouted impossibly from the uncultivated ground, growing to full height in moments. A perfect ear formed, husks peeling back to reveal kernels of unusual color, not yellow or white, but a deep amber that seemed to capture the morning sunlight. Foster understood this too, her first reward for honoring the bargain. She took the ear carefully, feeling both gift and obligation in its weight. The keeper receives, but the keeper must also give. The Merrick photograph would remain in the museum archives, its dark history now properly contextualized. But the true record of this ancient arrangement would be maintained through Foster's bloodline, through offerings and acknowledgement, through respect for boundaries both physical and spiritual. The restored boundary held, yet Foster soon discovered the bargain's deeper implications. Each night her dreams carried her back to the circle, showing her visions of past keepers, their triumphs and failures, their offerings and sacrifices. She witnessed the original covenant formed between the hunger and the indigenous peoples, how they'd understood the entity not as evil but as a force requiring balance, like fire, necessary but demanding respect. Most disturbing were the dreams of families who had broken faith, the Merricks and others before them. She experienced their terror when the hunger slipped its bonds, witnessed the Scarecrow figure standing at bedsides or seated at dinner tables, patient and unyielding in its demand for recognition. 3 months after the museum incident, Foster awoke to find soil on her kitchen floor, a perfect circle with tiny green shoots already emerging. A gentle reminder, she understood, that the quarter season had arrived. Time for the first promised offering. The museum board had reacted with skeptical accommodation to Foster's insistence on creating an exhibit honoring agricultural folk traditions of the region. They didn't fully comprehend the importance of acknowledging the hunger publicly, of teaching others to remember what had been forgotten, but they permitted it, particularly after anonymous donations from local farming families began arriving specifically for this purpose. They know, Eleanor had explained when Foster expressed surprise at the community response. Not completely, not consciously, but the old stories persist in fragments. Warnings passed through generations about certain lands, certain arrangements. Today, Foster carefully harvested herbs from her garden, plants grown from seeds taken from that first gifted ear of corn. She wove them into a small bundle with strands of her own hair, reciting Eleanor's song under her breath as she worked. The ritual wasn't just symbolic. She felt the hunger's attention focus upon her work, assessing her sincerity. The phone rang, startling her from concentration. It was Chambers, his voice tight with urgency. "Someone's breached the boundary," he said without preamble. "The monitoring equipment we installed shows disruption at the circle's edge, and there's a social media post. Teenagers planning to spend the night at the haunted Scarecrow field for some online challenge." Foster felt ice in her veins. The hunger had been patient these past months, accepting her regular offerings, seemingly content within its restored boundary. But trespassers, especially disrespectful ones, would be perceived differently. "How many?" she asked, already gathering her keys. "The post mentions 5 of them. They're planning to live stream at midnight." Foster checked her watch, just past sunset. "I'll meet you there. Bring Eleanor if you can reach her." As she drove toward the Merrick property, Foster felt something stir within her. Not just anxiety, but a disturbing resonance. The hunger was awake and alert, its awareness bleeding through their connection. She could feel its anticipation, its consideration of boundaries tested. Most concerning was the unsettling realization that part of her shared its indignation. The keeper protects the boundary, from both sides. The hunger must stay contained, but the boundary must also remain respected. And those who violated that respect must face consequences. Foster arrived at the Merrick property to find the teenagers had already begun their ill-advised expedition. Their parked cars lined the overgrown access road, headlights and smartphone flashlights dancing in the distance as they approached the circle. Through her connection with the entity, she felt its attention shift, curious, then increasingly agitated as the boundary was tested. "They don't understand what they're disturbing," Chambers said, appearing beside her, with Eleanor following close behind. The elder woman's face was grim in the moonlight. "The hunger has been patient," Eleanor observed, "but its nature remains unchanged. It will defend itself." Foster closed her eyes, focusing on the connection that now bound her to the entity. Through it, she could sense the teenagers, 5 of them as Chambers had said, laughing nervously as they filmed themselves stepping over the now visible boundary line, where vegetation changed abruptly from normal to unnaturally vibrant. "Something's happening," she whispered, opening her eyes. "The hunger is tasting them somehow, determining their intentions." In the distance, they could see the group approaching the central post. One boy carried a baseball bat, swinging it casually at the tall grass as he walked. Another passed around a bottle, their voices carrying faintly across the field as they dared each other to touch the creepy old stick. Foster felt it then, a surge of ancient rage flowing through her connection. The keeper in her recognized the transgression's severity, not just trespass, but threat, desecration. "We need to stop them before," Foster began. But her words died as she watched the perfect circle of vegetation suddenly ripple outward from the center, like a stone dropped in still water. The teenagers froze, their live stream presumably capturing the unnatural movement. Then the ground beneath them shifted, not violently, but with deliberate purpose. The soil rose in subtle waves, herding them like sheep, separating them from one another. "It's containing them," Chambers observed with academic detachment that barely masked his horror. "Isolating threats." Foster felt the hunger's intentions with growing alarm. Unlike before when rage had driven it beyond its boundaries, now it acted with calculated precision. The boy with the bat found himself surrounded by rapidly growing cornstalks, their growth audible even from a distance, a crackling, stretching sound as they reached full height in seconds, forming a perfect vegetative prison. "We have to intervene," Foster insisted, starting forward, but Eleanor caught her arm. "The keeper cannot simply command," she warned. "You must negotiate, reminded of balance." Foster understood then. Her role wasn't to control the hunger, but to maintain equilibrium between worlds. She removed the woven offering from her pocket, the one meant for the quarterly ritual, and held it up toward the field. "I acknowledge the trespass," she called out, her voice carrying with surprising strength, "but I offer proper tribute in exchange for mercy." The rippling ground stilled. The teenagers' frightened cries became audible in the sudden silence. Foster felt the entity's attention shift entirely to her, weighing, considering. "Remember our bargain," she continued, stepping forward deliberately. "They are ignorant, not malicious. Their punishment should be knowledge, not consumption." The hunger's consideration filtered through their connection, ancient alien thought processes contemplating concepts of justice and proportion. Foster stood her ground, understanding that this moment would define their arrangement for years to come. The cornstalks parted as Foster approached, forming an unnatural pathway leading directly to the wooden post at the circle's center. The teenagers' frightened faces glowed in the eerie light of their abandoned phones, screens illuminating their makeshift vegetative cages. The boy with the bat had dropped his weapon, now half submerged in soil that seemed to be slowly consuming it. "What's happening?" one girl whimpered, pressing against the living walls that contained her. Foster felt the hunger's attention divided between her and the trespassers, its ancient consciousness evaluating each heartbeat, each breath. Through their connection, she understood its judgment forming. These were not worthy offerings, merely ignorant interlopers, yet their disrespect demanded response. "This land has a caretaker," Foster announced, addressing both the teenagers and the entity listening through every blade of grass. "And you've entered without permission or proper respect." She knelt before the wooden post, placing her woven offering at its base. The soil stirred, small tendrils emerging to draw the bundle downward until it disappeared from sight. Foster felt immediate acknowledgement, the quarterly obligation fulfilled, but the current situation remained unresolved. "Please," another teenager called out, a tall boy whose bravado had evaporated entirely. "We didn't mean anything. It was just for views." "Intentions matter less than actions here," Foster replied, feeling the hunger's agreement resonate through her. "This place remembers every interaction, every trespass." Eleanor had followed Foster into the circle, her presence tolerated by the entity due to ancestral recognition. She carried something wrapped in red cloth, which she now unfolded to reveal 5 small clay vessels. "In my grandmother's time, those who disturbed sacred boundaries could atone through carrying a portion of the boundary's essence," she explained, placing the vessels in a smaller circle around the post, a reminder that travels with them. The hunger considered this proposal, its curiosity flowing through Foster's awareness. This was an old practice, one it recognized from before the broken promises. The vessels began to fill with soil from beneath, rich black earth that emanated the same subtle glow as the boundary line. Each of you will take one, Foster instructed the teenagers. Keep it somewhere visible in your homes. Care for what grows from it. This is both your protection and your obligation. The living cages slowly retracted, releasing their captives who stumbled forward on shaking legs. The entity's presence remained heavy in the air, watching through countless leaves and stems. "What if we don't?" the smallest boy asked, eyeing the vessels with justified suspicion. Foster felt the hunger's response before she spoke it, a flash of memory showing the Merrick family fleeing in the night, pursued by something that could never be outrun. "Then the hunger finds you anyway," she said simply. "It remembers those who take without giving. Distance provides no protection from broken promises." As each teenager reluctantly accepted a vessel, small green shoots immediately sprouted from the soil within, plants unlike any naturally occurring species, their leaves forming intricate patterns reminiscent of watching eyes. The boundary had been tested and defended, the balance maintained, if precariously, but Foster understood with growing clarity that her role as keeper would demand more than quarterly offerings. The hunger's patience was finite, its memory eternal. Generations passed as Foster's lineage maintained the ancient covenant with the land's guardian. Her great-granddaughter Meredith now wore the mantle of keeper, the bloodline obligation passing through whispered deathbed confessions and dreams that began in childhood, dreams of cornfields and watchful presences. Meredith stood before the wooden post on the autumn equinox, placing her carefully crafted offering at its base. The circle had remained stable for decades, the entity content within its boundaries as long as proper acknowledgments were made. The 5 families who had taken the vessels all those years ago had kept their word, maintaining their own miniature boundaries within their homes. Those small plants had grown into cherished family heirlooms, speaking occasionally to their caretakers through whispered insights or dreams of remarkable clarity. The families had formed a loose alliance over the decades, assisting each keeper when situations demanded collective vigilance. "Something's different today," Meredith murmured as the tendrils emerged to accept her offering. The soil's vibration carried unfamiliar undertones. Not hostile, but questioning. From the post, a thin green shoot emerged, growing rapidly upward until it bloomed into a perfect replica of the ear of corn gifted to Abigail Foster at the Covenant's renewal. Inside each kernel, Meredith could see tiny images, scenes from the hunger's long existence, memories preserved across countless seasons. Most revealed familiar fragments, the original boundary's creation, various keepers fulfilling their duties, trespassers facing consequences. But among them appeared new visions, vast fields withering under unseasonable heat, industrial chemicals seeping into groundwater, the delicate mycorrhizal networks beneath the soil fragmenting under changing conditions. "You're showing me the wider world," Meredith realized, understanding flowing through their connection. "The greater boundaries beyond our agreement are failing." The hunger's awareness pressed against her consciousness, more articulate than it had ever been with previous keepers. The entity had existed for millennia, witnessing countless environmental shifts, but never had changes come so rapidly or threatened the very fundament of its existence. Through their connection, Meredith grasped the deeper truth. The hunger wasn't simply a localized phenomenon, but part of an ancient system that maintained balance across larger ecosystems. Its containment had been necessary during times of human expansion, but perhaps complete separation was no longer the answer. The wooden post trembled slightly, and carved upon its surface appeared a new symbol, concentric circles expanding outward. "You want to extend your influence," Meredith whispered, a mixture of fear and understanding washing over her. "Not to consume, but to heal." The keeper's role had always been to maintain boundaries, but boundaries themselves were not immutable. What had begun as containment could evolve into collaboration if properly guided. The entity's hunger remained, but perhaps it could hunger for restoration rather than mere consumption. The 5 vessels in 5 households across the county glowed simultaneously that night, their caretakers awakening to plants that had suddenly doubled in size, their patterns shifting to match the new symbol on the boundary post. The hunger was preparing to walk again, but this time with purpose beyond itself, guided by generations of understanding rather than centuries of misinterpretation. The question remained whether Meredith would embrace this evolution of their covenant or maintain the boundaries established by her ancestors. The soil from the Merrick property proved more revealing than any historical document could have been. Under laboratory analysis, its composition defied conventional science, fertile beyond explanation, yet containing compounds that appeared almost crystalline under electron microscopy. These microscopic structures resembled neural networks, suggesting something beyond simple organic matter. Meredith Foster convened the 5 vessel families at the County Museum, now a nationally recognized center for agricultural history thanks to her great-grandmother's work. The descendants of those foolish teenagers had become essential partners in maintaining the delicate balance established generations ago. The hunger is communicating through all 5 vessels simultaneously, explained Daniel Ramirez, great-grandson of the deputy who had once been temporarily possessed. My plants are showing unusual growth patterns, forming shapes that resemble watershed maps of the entire region. Similar reports came from each family, their plants reconfiguring to display different aspects of the surrounding ecosystem. One showed soil degradation patterns, another revealed groundwater contamination from the new factory farm 20 miles away, while a third had developed leaves with patterns matching endangered pollinator migration routes. The boundary was never meant to be permanent, Meredith explained, spreading out her great-grandmother's original notes. Abigail understood this intuitively, but couldn't fully articulate it. The hunger was contained because balance required it at that time, but balance itself is dynamic. Eleanor Whitehawk's granddaughter, now a professor of indigenous agricultural practices, nodded thoughtfully. My grandmother's songs weren't just about establishing boundaries, but about knowing when to reshape them. Containment and release, like breathing. The museum's special collections room, built directly above where Deputy Ramirez had once been possessed, housed the original Merrick photograph in a specially designed case. Visitors often reported feeling watched when standing before it, though no one had reported seeing the Scarecrow move in decades. Today, however, the photograph had changed. The Scarecrow no longer stood at the field's edge, but directly behind the family, its burlap face appearing to look directly out at the viewers, as if finally acknowledged after decades of patient waiting. It's time, Meredith said simply. The ritual must evolve. That evening, under a waxing moon, the 6 families gathered at the boundary circle, each carrying their vessel. The perfect ring of vegetation had begun expanding slowly over recent months, not through aggression, but through invitation. Neighboring farmers had reported dreams of abundant harvests and had left small offerings at the property edge. As they positioned themselves around the wooden post, Meredith felt the hunger's awareness flow through her with unprecedented clarity. It no longer simply hungered for acknowledgement, but for participation in healing what had been broken across the wider landscape. The wooden post, weathered by over a century of containing the entity, began to sink slowly into the soil, not disappearing but transforming, spreading horizontally through root systems that glowed faintly beneath their feet, forming a new pattern that radiated outward rather than circling inward. The boundary wasn't dissolving but expanding, guided by generations of understanding rather than fear. What the Merricks had fled from in terror would now walk purposefully into a world that desperately needed ancient wisdom about balance and reciprocity. The restored boundary expanded not as invasion but as invitation, reaching finger-like tendrils through soil and root systems across the county. Farmers who had never heard the Merrick tale nonetheless found themselves leaving small offerings at field edges, first fruits, handfuls of seeds, or cups of spring water, without fully understanding why. Something ancient stirred in collective memory, a knowing beyond conscious thought. Meredith visited each farm where the boundary had extended, explaining enough to provide context without causing panic. Most nodded with recognition rather than surprise, as if confirming something they'd always suspected about their connection to the land. My grandfather used to say our best fields had personalities, elderly farmer Joseph Williams told her, standing at the edge of his cornfield, where stalks grew visibly greener where the boundary had reached. Said sometimes the land decides what it wants to grow, not the farmer. Thought he was just being superstitious. Turns out, he was remembering. The hunger, once contained through fear and misunderstanding, now flowed purposefully through failing ecosystems. Where industrial fertilizers had sterilized soil microbiomes, mycelial networks regenerated with extraordinary speed. Contaminated watersheds gradually cleared as something in the water's molecular structure realigned. Dormant seed banks awakened after decades of slumber. Scientists documented the phenomena without comprehending its source, publishing papers on spontaneous ecosystem resilience, and cryptobiotic soil activation. A few connected these patterns to indigenous agricultural practices, coming tantalizingly close to understanding without grasping the entity's direct influence. The vessel families reported their plants changing again, no longer displaying problems, but showing solutions unfolding in real time. Their role shifted from containing small fragments of the hunger to serving as communication conduits, allowing the entity to coordinate its efforts across distances. In dreams, Meredith witnessed the hunger's true nature more clearly than any keeper before her. Not malevolence, but necessity, an ancient intelligence that experienced the world through consumption and regeneration, through death feeding life in endless cycles. Its anger toward breaking of bargains hadn't stemmed from petty vengeance, but from genuine grief at witnessing balance destroyed. The Merrick photograph, still displayed in the museum, continued its subtle transformation. Visitors reported the family's expressions seemed to soften imperceptibly over time. The fear in their eyes gradually replaced with what looked almost like understanding. The Scarecrow figure remained directly behind them, but its posture appeared less threatening, more protective. One morning, Meredith found Daniel Ramirez waiting outside her home, his vessel cradled carefully in his hands. Within it grew something entirely new, a plant with spiral-patterned leaves surrounding a small, perfectly formed ear of corn, unlike any cultivated variety. "It spoke to me directly last night," Daniel said, voice hushed with wonder rather than fear. "Not with words, but I understood anyway. The hunger has grown beyond needing a single keeper. It needs partners." Meredith nodded, unsurprised. The boundary between keeper and kept was always artificial. The Merricks fled because they couldn't accept their place within a greater system, not merely as masters of the land, but as participants in its cycles. The hunger no longer walked as a singular entity, but flowed as consciousness through awakening ecosystems, slumbering intelligence within all living things, gradually remembering their interconnection. Not magic, but relationship. Not supernatural, but deeply natural, reminding humans of bargains older than memory. The first portion, Meredith whispered, understanding at last. It was never about feeding something separate from ourselves. It was acknowledging that we too are consumed, transformed, and reborn through the hunger that moves through all things. The boundary stretched across more than physical space. It extended across time itself. In the county museum's deepest archives, Meredith discovered a journal from 1905, written by Thomas Merrick himself. The weathered pages revealed what no photograph could capture. Merrick hadn't found the Scarecrow upon purchasing the land. He had created it. "To contain what lives beneath our soil," Thomas had written in increasingly erratic handwriting. "The previous owner showed me the ritual, said his family performed it for generations before the soil soured on them. A vessel for the unquenchable hunger, anchored by my own blood." The entries described how Thomas had cut his palm, letting blood soak into straw and burlap, creating not just a scarecrow, but a prison of flesh and fiber. The land's extraordinary fertility came not from some bargain with an existing entity, but from something Thomas himself had awakened and then attempted to contain. "The hunger was always here," Meredith whispered, understanding washing over her as she traced the faded ink with trembling fingers. Not separate from the land, but fundamental to it. The indigenous people never tried to contain it. They lived in balance with it. The final journal pages revealed Thomas Merrick's fatal mistake. After the bountiful harvest, he'd attempted to break the binding that connected him to the land's hunger. The ritual required blood to create, and blood to unmake. But instead of releasing the connection properly, he'd tried to sever it completely. "What flows between us cannot be cut without consequence," he'd written the night before their disappearance. "It follows through bloodlines. I tried to break free entirely, but I've only given it a taste for what runs in our veins." Meredith gathered the vessel families immediately, her heart pounding with urgent understanding. "We're not just keepers," she explained, showing them the journal. "We're anchors. Our bloodlines don't just maintain the boundary, they are the boundary." The truth crystallized with terrible clarity. The hunger hadn't been contained by the wooden post or ritual offerings. It had been threaded through human lineages, bound to families rather than locations. The boundaries weakened whenever bloodlines thinned or rituals were forgotten. "That's why it's expanding now," Daniel Ramirez realized, looking at his vessel with new comprehension. "There are more of us acknowledging the connection. More anchors, more pathways. The Scarecrow was never the entity itself, merely the first physical manifestation, a focal point created from Thomas Merrick's desperate attempt to control what he'd awakened. Every keeper since had maintained this misunderstanding, believing they were containing something external when they were actually channeling something that flowed through their very veins. The first portion was never crops, Meredith said softly. It was always us, not consumed, but participating. The hunger doesn't want our destruction. It wants recognition that we are not separate from what feeds and is fed upon. The museum photograph seemed to confirm this revelation. Under special light, conservators discovered blood mixed with the photographic chemicals. Thomas Merrick hadn't just captured an image that day. He'd created another anchor point, another boundary stretching across time, waiting for someone to finally understand the truth flowing beneath everything. The Merrick property had become a place of pilgrimage in the years that followed the boundary's expansion. Farmers brought their children to learn the rituals of acknowledgement. Scientists conducted research that blended modern techniques with ancient wisdom, and the vessel families gathered quarterly to synchronize their understanding of the hunger's intentions. Meredith Foster walked among fields of experimental crops designed to heal depleted soils, plants with root systems capable of breaking through hardpan, drawing toxins upward, transforming them into harmless compounds. These weren't genetically modified in laboratories but cultivated through careful conversation with the hunger itself, guided by dreams and the intricate patterns forming in vessel plants. "It's changing us," Daniel Ramirez observed, kneeling to examine soil that glittered with microscopic networks visible to the naked eye. "Not just our understanding, but our perception." Meredith nodded, having noticed the subtle shifts in her own consciousness. She could sense root systems beneath her feet now, feel the slow movement of nutrients through mycorrhizal highways. The hunger's awareness had begun flowing through human nervous systems just as it flowed through plant tissues, not as invasion, but as expanded sensation. "Thomas Merrick feared this," she replied. "He thought he was being consumed when he was actually being invited into deeper participation." The Merrick photograph had been relocated from the museum to a small structure at the center of the original circle, where the wooden post had once stood. The building wasn't a shrine, but a teaching space, where visitors could experience the fuller sensory dimensions of what the hunger offered. Many reported seeing movement within the photograph now, not just the scarecrow, but the crops themselves, living and breathing across the barrier of time. More remarkable were the children born to vessel families in recent years. Each arrived with birthmarks resembling the spiral patterns found in the vessels, their eyes containing flecks of green regardless of genetic heritage. In preschool, teachers noted these children drew identical patterns when asked to illustrate their dreams, concentric circles expanding outward, networks of connections between seemingly separate objects. "They won't need vessels or rituals," Eleanor's granddaughter remarked. "They're born already understanding what took us generations to remember." County agricultural records showed measurable changes in regional ecology, increased biodiversity, climate resilience, and soil carbon sequestration that defied models. What began as restoration of one damaged circle had become transformation of entire watersheds. The hunger worked through human hands and minds now, guiding decisions about planting, harvesting, and land stewardship. Most profound was the discovery that the Merricks themselves had not perished as everyone assumed. Genealogical research revealed descendants living scattered across the country, each family carrying subtle genetic markers that differentiated them, higher concentrations of fungal microbiomes in their gut flora, unusual electrical patterns in neural imaging. Through dreams, these distant relatives began returning to their ancestral land, drawn by a calling they couldn't articulate, but instinctively understood. The hunger had never forgotten its first family, never stopped seeking reunion across generations. What Thomas Merrick had feared as pursuit had always been invitation, the completion of a circle broken by misunderstanding and fear. The boundary between human and other had always been more permeable than anyone understood. What appeared as ancient entity, as other, was simply the first language of life itself, speaking again through those willing to listen. The final transformation manifested gradually yet unmistakably, witnessed first by children born to the vessel families. These young ones would stand before the Merrick photograph and converse with it as though greeting old friends. The family in the image no longer appeared frozen in that moment of 1906, but seemed to breathe and shift subtly, their expressions evolving from wariness to serene acceptance. "They're healing too," whispered 7-year-old Lily Ramirez, her spiral birthmark glowing faintly as she pressed her palm against the glass. They were just scared because they didn't understand what was happening to them. The photograph itself had become something beyond artifact, a permeable membrane between past and present, where understanding flowed in both directions. Conservators noted impossible changes in the physical properties of the paper and chemicals, as though the image continuously developed itself, revealing deeper layers of truth with each passing season. Most remarkable was the discovery made when Meredith compared Thomas Merrick's bloodline with her own. Genetic testing revealed a startling truth. Abigail Foster, who had first noticed the anomalies in the photograph, shared distant ancestry with the Merricks themselves. The hunger had not randomly chosen its new keeper, but had called to blood that recognized blood, completing a circle broken generations earlier. The Scarecrow was never meant to be feared, Meredith explained during the autumn equinox gathering. It was Thomas Merrick himself, reaching forward through time, trying to warn, while also seeking reconciliation. The entity that local folklore had labeled the Hunger revealed itself more completely through the vessel plants, not something separate from humanity, but the living consciousness of reciprocity itself, the awareness that permeates all ecological relationships. What appeared supernatural was simply nature operating at a level of complexity beyond human comprehension, until humans themselves evolved to perceive it. On the 100th anniversary of the Merrick's flight from their farm, descendants from both the Merrick and Foster lineages gathered before the photograph. As they joined hands, forming a living circle, the image rippled visibly. The Scarecrow figure stepped forward to stand beside the family rather than behind them, its burlap face reshaping into recognizable human features. Thomas Merrick himself, no longer imprisoning or imprisoned, but participating. In that moment, witnesses described seeing not just the photograph change, but the very land around them. Past and present overlapped briefly, revealing the Merrick farm as it had been and as it could be, abundant, integrated, alive with conscious purpose. The boundary between eras thinned just as the boundary between species had, revealing that time itself was merely another dimension of the greater circle. The photograph would remain, but its purpose had evolved from warning to teaching. What began as a family portrait capturing a moment of fear had become a window through which future generations could glimpse the greater truth, that humans were never meant to stand apart from the hunger that moves through all living things, but to consciously embody it, guiding its ancient wisdom toward healing rather than mere consumption. The circle was complete, the boundary transformed, the first portion freely given. Meredith stood where the Merrick family had posed over a century ago, feeling the convergence of past and present as soil shifted subtly beneath her feet. The museum had established a permanent exhibit dedicated to agricultural relationships rather than mere history, focusing on the delicate balance between giving and taking that defined true stewardship. Visitors from across the country now brought soil samples from their own troubled lands, seeking guidance from what the scientific community had reluctantly termed regenerative intelligence, still unable to fully acknowledge the conscious awareness that flowed through the boundaries' expanding influence. Each sample was analyzed not just in laboratories but through direct communion with the vessel plants, which could detect imbalances invisible to modern instruments. "We've come full circle," Eleanor's granddaughter remarked, watching children playing at the field's edge without fear. Unlike the Merrick children who had never turned their backs to the Scarecrow, these young ones moved freely, instinctively aware of boundaries without being constrained by them. The most profound revelation had emerged when linguists studied Thomas Merrick's final journal entries alongside surviving indigenous texts describing the original relationship with the land. The word translated as hunger carried nuances lost in English. It simultaneously meant that which consumes and that which transforms through consumption, not a predatory force, but a necessary catalyst in cycles of renewal. They never worshipped it, Daniel explained to visiting researchers. They recognized themselves within it. The hunger wasn't something to fear, but something to become, conscious participants in consumption and regeneration. What Thomas Merrick had mistakenly attempted to contain was actually the land's intrinsic capacity for relationship, its desire for cooperative transformation rather than mere exploitation. The Scarecrow form had been the entity's attempt to communicate through symbols Merrick might understand, to embody itself in terms recognizable to human perception. Most significantly, archaeologists had recently uncovered evidence that the boundary post predated European settlement by centuries, not as containment but as invitation. The carefully carved symbols formed a sophisticated communication system, designating the circle as a place where humans might enter into deeper communion with processes normally operating beyond conscious awareness. The Merricks didn't flee from a monster, Meredith told those who still approached the story with fear. They fled from evolution, from becoming something beyond what they understood themselves to be. As twilight settled over the fields, Meredith completed preparations for the final transition ritual. The vessel plants had begun producing seeds that incorporated both human and plant DNA, not through modern genetic manipulation, but through the ancient alchemical processes that had always blurred the boundaries between seemingly separate life forms. Tomorrow these seeds would be planted in a spiraling pattern extending outward from the original circle. Not just crops, but new anchors, new pathways through which awareness could flow between species. The hunger would walk not as separate entity, but as integrated consciousness. Humans remembering they had always been expressions of the land itself, temporarily forgotten but finally returning to recognition. As darkness fell completely, the distant figures of the Merrick family seemed to watch from across time, no longer in terror but in wonder at what their broken boundary had ultimately created. The photograph sat in its custom-made display case, now the centerpiece of the museum's permanent exhibition titled, "The Hunger That Walks, A Century of Reciprocity." Visitors often remarked how the image seemed to change depending on when they viewed it, sometimes showing a frightened family posed stiffly before their homestead, sometimes revealing a group at peace with the tall figure standing among them. Today, on the anniversary of Abigail Foster's first discovery, Meredith placed her palm against the glass. The surface felt warm, almost like living skin. Through her touch, she sensed generations of understanding flowing in both directions, past informing present, present healing past. "They see now," she whispered to the Merrick family. "We all do." The county had become a case study in ecological resurrection. Universities sent researchers to document the unprecedented restoration of degraded landscapes, the return of species long absent, the curious fact that crops grown within the expanding boundary required no pesticides yet remained remarkably resistant to disease and climate extremes. Few outside the vessel families understood the complete truth, but that was changing with each child born bearing the spiral birthmarks, each one instinctively recognizing their place within greater cycles of consumption and renewal. These children spoke of dreams where they walked through cornfields with Thomas Merrick himself, learning directly from the man who had first misunderstood, then feared, and finally embraced the hunger that moved through all living things. The museum's guest book contained thousands of entries from farmers who had implemented the Merrick method on their own lands, leaving first portions, acknowledging the conscious relationship between themselves and what they cultivated. Many reported similar experiences, plants that seemed to communicate needs, intuitive knowledge of when to harvest, and most remarkably, a profound sense of belonging rather than ownership. As twilight fell on the exhibition hall, Meredith witnessed something only the keepers and vessel families had previously seen. Thomas Merrick stepped fully out of the photograph, no longer bound by paper and chemical, and smiled at her with eyes that contained the same spiral patterns as the vessel plants. "We never truly left," he said, his voice like rustling corn leaves. "We just changed forms." Behind him, the rest of the family emerged as well, no longer frightened but serene, having completed their century-long transformation. Mary Merrick nodded to Meredith in recognition of shared bloodlines and shared purpose. "The circle was never broken," she said, "only expanding." They remained visible just long enough to be captured by the museum's security cameras, proof that would transform scientific understanding of consciousness, boundaries, and the permeable nature of time itself. By morning, the footage had reached research institutions worldwide, contributing to a fundamental shift in how humans perceived their relationship with the living world around them. The hunger still walked, but no longer alone. It moved through human awareness, through interconnected ecosystems, through the spiral patterns that appeared in everything from vessel plants to human DNA to galaxy formations, the universal signature of consumption that generates rather than depletes. And in every field touched by its influence, scarecrows stood not as warnings, but as reminders, anchors connecting past wisdom to future potential, embodiments of the human capacity to participate consciously in cycles once feared, now embraced. Another photograph, another dark secret revealed. Until next time, this has been Shadow Frames.